Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try to help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Today I'm going to continue our series of signposts on 1 Peter, and I'm going to read just a couple of verses from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives amongst the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Well, these verses have been described as the pivotal passage in 1 Peter. Well, I think that might be an overstatement. It certainly marks a transition from the opening themes in the opening section and the development through the rest of the letter. In the opening section, Peter emphasised that these believers are living a life of hope in this world, a life that's solidly rooted in the fact that of the resurrection of Jesus and in their own experience of new birth. And it's joyfully maintained despite the sufferings that they undergo, since these are a means of strengthening and proving their faith. As children of God, they must live lives that reflect his holiness. And thus far, Peter has expressed how that works within the fellowship of the church in their sincere love for one another. Now he begins to turn his attention to how that works out in relation to the world outside the church. And how are they to live as holy children of God in a pagan society? And then goes on to direct them as to how they might live in relation to the civic authorities and within a wide range of family relationships. In short, Peter really, this is a kind of transition point which Peter begins to turn his attention to how Christians should live daily in the world. As we noted at the outset of this series of signposts, 1 Peter is an intensely practical letter that underscores the truth that faith in Jesus is not something belonging to the inner world of our thoughts and feelings. Faith is a lived out, embodied allegiance to Jesus as the saving King. And that living out ought to impact and shape every aspect of our daily lives. And consequently, it should have an impact, a positive impact on the world around us. But before we can begin to explore what he says, I think we've got to confront the fact that the world that he was speaking about and that these Christians were living in was vastly different from ours. His was a very hierarchical society, rigidly stratified according to social class. It was also a very patriarchal society in which the role and status of women was vastly different from today. Furthermore, these Christians lived within the Roman Empire at a time when it had become no longer a republic really, but a despotic regime in which the emperor ruled supreme. With that in mind, we have to approach these verses carefully in the understanding that at the face value, some of what Peter says in the rest of the letter doesn't have an obvious application for us today in our world. But a basic principle of biblical interpretation is when a command doesn't directly apply to the modern world is to look for the guiding principle behind the command and consider how that principle might be applied today. And that's the approach that will be taken in this and all the following signposts. Peter firstly calls them dear friends or beloved. It's a very Christian term, as Ben Witherington notes. It's hardly ever found outside of early Christian literature. He goes on to say that its function is twofold. Firstly, it serves as a term of endearment to bind the author emotionally with his audience, letting them know that they are loved by Peter, by God, by the body of Christ. In short, they're not abandoned or alone, though they may feel that way as resident aliens and sojourners or strangers. As a term of endearment, secondly, it makes what follows have more pathos and be empathetic. And it's that pathos and empathy that leads Peter to urge rather than command them to a course of action. As one commentator notes, the word Peter uses there is more than a request, but it's slightly less than a command. So Peter refers to them as aliens and strangers. Once again, he is hinting at the social reality that these believers were living in. And understanding that social reality is crucial if we're to make sense of the instructions that will follow from verse 13. As aliens and strangers, they didn't have full rights of citizenship, and so their social status and their legal status were very precarious. And in Roman society, social status was all important. Witherington makes the important point that although their conversion had not created their social condition, it had made that condition more precarious. I think it will be helpful for us to consider one example of what that actually means and what it looked like in their everyday lives, because their status as aliens and strangers or sojourners really affected every other part of their life in the city. Having pledged their allegiance to Jesus, they could not participate in worshipping the emperor, for example, or indeed any of the other gods in the city. They couldn't participate in any religious ceremonies, all of which had a major impact on their place in society. We live in a multi-faith society, and in theory at least, people are free to worship whichever god they wish without fear or prejudice. In theory. However, worship of the gods in first century Asia Minor affected a whole range of social relationships. And writing just a few decades later about these very same this same area, these same churches, John highlights the situation in the city of Pergamum as an example. Every day people would offer up an animal sacrifice to whichever god they wanted to worship. And part of that offering was given back to the worshippers who would eat it at a feast in honour of that god. Commerce in the city was regulated by trade guilds. If you wanted to do business, you had to be a member of the guild. And that meant you had to participate in the feasts held to celebrate the patron god of that guild. In other words, virtually every social event in their culture involved eating meat that had been offered to idols. In both Jewish and non-Jewish cultures, eating a meal with someone created a relationship bond of mutual loyalty and friendship, and it brought with it covenant-like obligations. For the non-Jews, the god being honoured at the feast was assumed to be present as a guest at the feast. And so, just as a bond of friendship was created between the people sharing the meal together, so too a bond was created between the god and their worshippers at the feast. As Darrell Johnson correctly notes, the New Testament does not present the eating of meat offered to idols as a neutral act. Idol worship opens the worshipper up to the unseen realm. Idols, of course, are not only made of wood and stone, they're made of cultural values, political agendas, lifestyles, corporate ethos, even religious movements. Idolatry of any sort is never a neutral act. Indeed, it is always a positive evil. The great commentator C.K. Barrett notes that the reason it's evil is that it robs God of the glory that is his alone and brings people into intimate relation with the evil spiritual powers. The prohibitions against eating food offered to idols in Acts 15 and Paul's long discussion of it in 1 Corinthians 8 suggest that for Christians living in this environment and perhaps newly converted from it, this was a problem not easily solved. It conflicted with their call to be exclusively loyal to Jesus. David Garland writes that disassociating themselves from all overtly idolatrous celebrations demanded from them an uncompromising devotion that could only invite ostracism from their unbelieving family and associates and lead to shame and material loss. It was a big deal for them not to participate in this. Even if they had been citizens and not resident aliens, this one issue alone would have led them to being ostracized by family and friends, by business associates, to be looked on with scorn and suspicion. Although there doesn't seem to be any state-sponsored persecution happening at this stage, Peter does allude to the fact that they're suffering. In verse 12, he suggests they've already been falsely accused of doing wrong. In verse 15, he suggests that ignorant, slanderous things have been said about them. And in verse 18 to 21, we learn that some of the Christians who were slaves were being mistreated by their masters. So it's not surprising then that he's kind of instructing them to be careful not to, in a sense, unnecessarily provoke those who are in authority, either in the home or in the wider society. The point is that provided nothing in their conduct causes that offence, they can expect at least some assistance from the civic authorities when falsely accused or treated unjustly. But it should be noted that he's advising them not to cause offence, but not at the expense of loyalty to Jesus. That's really important. And it's interesting that in his response, Peter doesn't suggest that what they should do is take over the organs of the state to seek political power, as many Christians are suggesting today, particularly in the kind of so-called Christian nationalism in the United States. Rather, his advice as to how to live in this difficult and precarious situation is twofold. Firstly, he tells them to abstain from sinful desires. As aliens and strangers, it would be really tempting for them to go with the flow of the moral behaviour of the city, because that would gain them social acceptance. It would reduce suspicion of their otherness and their strange religious practices. And the pagans really thought that the Christian practices were very strange indeed. Vices, they called them. Peter has already told these Christians to put off those kinds of behaviours, and he reinforces that here. For such behaviour wars against the soul. In other words, we cannot faithfully follow Christ and at the same time deliberately indulge in and engage in sinful behaviour, pursuing sinful desires, nullifies any of the moral claims about Jesus that we make. Secondly, he tells them to live a good life. Now, the word translated as good in verse 12 refers to beauty, and in this context, it's understood as an outward sign of the inward good. It carries the idea of something that is noble, honourable character, something that is good or worthy, and crucially, that is seen to be good and worthy. So it's good that is appealing to others and perhaps inspires or motivates them to embrace what is lovely, beautiful, and praiseworthy. The word translated as see refers to careful watching over a period of time rather than a momentary or casual glance. So the goodness that Peter's referring to is something that is demonstrably good and consistently so, that will be recognised as being good even by the pagans. Having been the victim of slander, I know it's very difficult to combat. People believe what they want to believe, and that goes double today in this polarised age of fake news, when people are usually all too willing to believe what they hear. In fact, the only way you can disprove slanderous accusations is by your good conduct. Peter suggests that when those who see the good that they do after having slandered and criticised them, well, they will recognise the good and glorify God because of it. What Peter's basically saying here is that as they live out their allegiance to Jesus, doing good to all in his name, doing no harm to anyone, that behaviour will be attractive, drawing attention in a positive way, and it will show that the accusations against them are patently false. We should note that in urging them to consider this course of action, Peter is really just repeating the commands of Jesus. For example, in Matthew 5, verses 14 to 16, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." With that in mind, I think we must be careful not to misunderstand a truth or neglect a truth that lies behind Peter's advice to them. For the attractiveness of their lives and their moral conduct is meant to be a genuine reflection of the truth of their inner lives. Peter's not suggesting that they put on a cloak of good behaviour or make a pretense of good conduct. Rather, their goodness should express the truth of their inner lives that have been transformed by Jesus. And so their good conduct is effectively just the radiance of the light of Christ that is within them. Of course, that immediately raises a question as to what extent our lives have been transformed by our relationship with Jesus. It seems clear that these Christians were living in a way that was noticeably and distinctly different from their non-Christian neighbours, and that difference was causing them to be slandered, mistreated, and falsely accused. In contrast, in the 20th and 21st century, study after study has shown that the lives of so-called Bible-believing Christians is no different than that of those of their non-Christian neighbours, and in fact may be morally worse. The reason that Christians are so often accused of being homophobic, judgmental, hypocritical and bigoted is because that is the way that Christians often behave. And, my news feed is filled every day with a story of another, celebrity pastor or youth worker or Christian worker in some way who's been sacked or arrested because of their moral behaviour. At the very least, all of that calls into question the authenticity of such claims, or the claims of many to be Christian. For to be Christian is, if nothing else, to be like Christ. That's what the word means. Christian is a little Christ. I wonder, have we compromised faithful Christ-like living for the peace and comfort of social acceptance? Or have we believed a false gospel that says Jesus died on the cross so that we could go to heaven when we die, a gospel that has little or no bearing on our lives here and now? I'm not suggesting that we all get a soapbox and head for the nearest street corner and start pointing out and telling everyone what's wrong with their lives. But I am suggesting that we must find a way to be distinctly Christ-like amid the interconnected complexities of the world in which we now live. To be Christ-like without compromising Christ. The Bible tells us that we are citizens of heaven, but we are also that we live here on earth within a particular society, and God expects us to live in that society as his children, whom Peter's already said are to be holy. He expects us to impact that society, and one of the ways, according to Peter, that we do that is by demonstrating the goodness of God in our own good conduct. We may now live in a multicultural and multi-faith society, but it's one that's no more or less opposed to God's rule than previous generations and previous civilizations. And there's plenty of evidence nowadays that the opposition to faith beliefs, especially to Christianity, is on the increase. We are and will be increasingly faced with a choice: to live out our pledged allegiance to Jesus as a saving King, or to compromise that allegiance in some way to avoid social dislocation and suffering, to avoid being ostracized and slandered and falsely accused and ridiculed. In the verses that follow in the rest of this chapter that we're going to explore later, we'll explore Peter's description of what the good life it looks like in real situations. And hopefully that will signpost the way forward for us to work out how we can live a good life, even though our world is very different from Peter's world. The principle remains true. The way that we live in the midst of this pagan society, well, there's two things in these verses. That we have not to pursue sinful desires, and that we're to live such good lives amongst the pagans that they will see it and glorify God because of it. Thanks for listening.